this issue, taking the initiative to create an entirely new military body to protect America's cyber channels. But yet, a crucial piece of our new cyber strategy remains missing. There is no legal framework to guide the U.S. in defending and responding to attacks, which is why my partner and I are resolved that the United States federal government should significantly reform its policy towards Russia. To bring clarity to the round, we want to begin by defining some key terms in our definitions. The first definition is towards, with regard to, for, or about. Secondly, significantly, important, of consequence, dictionary.com. Now that we've defined our terms, we can move on to contention 1, the status quo. Point 1, the United States Cyber Command was created to protect from cyber attacks, according to the International Relations and Security Network on December 20, 2010. Believing that the cyber threat had outgrown the military's existing structures, Defense Secretary Robert Gates ordered the creation of the U.S. Cyber Command in June 2009 to consolidate disparate units under Alexander's command. Cyber Command was officially activated in May of this year, becoming fully operational last month. The command is charged with centralizing and coordinating Department of Defense cyber operations to include defensive and, when directed, offensive operations, end quote. What this first example shows us is that the United States currently has a functioning military organization to deal with cyber attacks. However, this organization is hamstrung by the lack of any cohesive definition, as described in our second point, point 2. The U.S. lacks a clear definition about what cyber war actually is. The Government Computer News Agency reported on August 16, 2010, that the Cyber Command is charged with conducting and defending the nation against war in cyberspace. But we don't really understand what cyber war is, retired Air Force General and former CIA Director Michael Hayden said recently. We're thinking a lot about it, but not very clearly. We're a bit sloppy with our language. We throw the phrase cyber war at anything uncomfortable happening on the web. From these two inherency points, we can see that the current system is failing to adequately provide a legislative framework to protect U.S. citizens, which is why we propose the following plan. This plan is to be implemented by the President, Congress, and any other necessary agency. Our plan has one mandate. The United States will adopt the East-West Institute's joint Russia-U.S. taxonomy for the cyber realm, so as to better coordinate government efforts and present an international legal framework to recognize and respond to attacks. This plan will take effect immediately after an affirmative ballot. Any funding required for this plan will come through normal means, and the affirmative will reserve the right to clarify this plan throughout all future speeches. In essence, our plan creates a government-wide set of definitions to be used when crafting cyber policy, using the East-West Institute's definition of a cyber attack, which they define as an offensive use of a cyber weapon intended to harm a designated target, among other definitions. We will establish a clear guiding principle for the entirety of the U.S. government. The purpose of these definitions is to make sure that our current efforts at protecting U.S. infrastructure and networks is not wasted from the lack of political will to give the military framework in which to conduct cyber operations. Moving on now to our second contention, we'll see the justifications for this plan in contention 2, justifications. Justification 1, Russia has a new military doctrine, according to the Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Studies in March 21, 2011. In February 2010, Russia published its new military doctrine, outlining its objectives in modern military conflicts, including the prior implementation of measures of informational warfare in order to achieve political objectives without the utilization of military forces. From this evidence, we can see that Russia has not been shy about making their goals known. In their year-old cyber doctrine, they look to execute political objectives using cyber attacks rather than conventional military force. This clearly poses a threat to the United States and is something that we must be prepared for. Without a clear definition, we wouldn't be able to adequately deal with an attack through a legal channel, something critics have long cited as a shortcoming, as CBS reported in 2010. Critics have long complained that defense officials have not yet detailed what constitutes a cyber attack. They warn that the uncertain nature of the government's cyber warfare policies could lead to them being used hastily and ill-advisedly during a crisis. From justification 1, we see a need for a definition to deal with the Russian threat in a way that is constructive and keeps us and others accountable in cyberspace. We are held accountable to using weapons only when necessary, and Russia is held accountable and when they've known they've gone too far. We'll now move on to our second justification. Justification 2, common understanding brings security. According to the U.S. Army War College in 2009. Definitions of cyber war and related terms are critical because they will drive how the laws of war and international treaties prescribe the scope and use of cyber capabilities for martial purposes. In other words, Norms and definitions guide how states will behave in cyberspace. The lack of a common understanding regarding cyber attacks causes uncertainty that could unintentionally escalate conflicts if states have a different interpretation of what is permissible in cyberspace. A common understanding of cyber war will also guide how a state can deter cyber attacks." End quote. Justification 3. Definitions will bring understanding between Russia and the U.S. According to the East-West Institute in 2011. Russian and U.S. national security stakeholders must acknowledge that the current uncertainty about the definition for war in cyberspace is not acceptable and be committed to seeking clarity. Our fourth and final justification is that the lack of a definition allows unscrupulous nations to take charge, according to the U.S. Army War College in 2009. There is currently no binding international law on cybersecurity that expresses the common will of countries. In fact, the lack of international norms, laws, and definitions to govern state actions in cyberspace has led to a gray area that can be exploited by aggressive states. For example, the head of the Russian Military Forecasting Center stated that the attacks against Estonia had not violated any international agreements because no such agreements exist, suggesting that even if Russia's complicity could be proved, Estonia's options for reprisal were limited. Such an environment thwarts deterrence because it lowers the probability of reprisal even if the attacker's identity is suspected. End quote. In this final justification, Russia's motive is clear: continue to abuse the lack of any clear definitions in the cyber realm. Through the U.S. institution of a definition, we'll have a clear international standard set forth of what we will and will not tolerate in cyberspace, and there we will draw the line. In closing, through this case there has been demonstrated a clear need for a new U.S. action in the area of cybersecurity. Our efforts right now are a step in the right direction, but the lack of a definition to bring clarity and purpose to the infrastructure that we have set up is a great and detrimental harm to the United States. From the justifications, a clear need can be seen for new effort on the part of the United States to take a stand and clearly delineate its position on cyber attacks so that aggressive nations cannot take advantage of our lack of law, but rather be brought to an understanding of when they've gone too far. Thank you, and I now stand open for questions.
All right, how you doing today in class?
Doing pretty good, Dave. How about you?
Pretty good, thanks. Can I first see a copy of the one I see?
Sure.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
My first question for you is, under your plan, you talked about how the United States will adopt the East-West Institute like recommendations, and then you moved down to talk about a definition, and then you said we're adopting that definition among other definitions. Is that correct?
Our mandate specifically says that yes, we're adopting the East-West Institute's definitions for multiple cyber terms, one of them being cyber attack.
Okay, what are all those other definitions?
All those other definitions, I'm not aware of them. They do define cyber warfare, cyber crime. I do believe they define the cyber realm. There's a lot of them. My partner can hand you the entire report if you'd like to see it.
Okay, that'd be great. Does Russia have a definition of cyber warfare?
Right now?
Yes.
I'm not aware.
Okay, so my question is, if we institute the United States definition of cyber warfare, and Russia has their own definition of cyber warfare, how is the United States supposed to prosecute if Russia doesn't view our definition as valid?
Because anything that has to pertain to our nation and our domestic affairs falls under our law. So what we consider to be an act of war against our state is legal for us to respond to under U.S. law.
Okay. All right, and moving down into justification 1, you talked about how Russia has a military doctrine. Did they ever say in that doctrine that they would use their capabilities against the United States?
However, they did not say specifically against the United States. However, what we do see is they are incredibly aggressive inside of cyberspace. They've already attacked Estonia and taken advantage of that gray area that we stated. And additionally, a Russian general believes they will be in a cyber war, a large cyber war, in 3 years.
Sure, okay, but does Russia have anything to gain from attacking the United States with a cyber attack?
As we said, political objectives. So
What political objectives would that be?
Right, in the future, if there's something that Russia disagrees with us on and they want to get that objective basically passed and then for us to agree with them, they could attack us in the cyber realm.
Okay, all right, moving down, you mentioned how right now we can't operate through a legal framework. Can you take me through that legal framework? If Russia attacks us, what's the legal process to actually prosecute them and bring them to justice? What would that entail?
The legal process is responding to their attack with an attack. That's generally what war is constituted of.
Okay, so without a definition, we can't respond to them with an attack.
Without a definition, we don't have a legal standard set forth of what Cyber Command can respond to. They don't know what to consider an attack right now because the government hasn't told them. So Cyber Command doesn't know what to respond to, and additionally, we don't know what policies we can craft around these kinds of attacks.
Okay, and so if we're attacked with a cyber attack from Russia, you're saying that it would wipe out basically our entire cyber system, correct?
I never stated that. The effects of a cyber attack can be varied. It can be limited or it can be large, depending on where you attack and how much damage you can do.
Okay, and has Russia ever attacked us with a cyber attack before in the past?
Right now,
In the past?
Not to my knowledge.
So they've never attacked us in the past?
Not to my knowledge, but they have attacked other nations, as we stated, and they are incredibly aggressive in this cyber realm.
Okay, all right. In justification two, you talked about common understanding, and you said it leads to a common understanding. Now that was talking about a variety of different states coming together on a common understanding, correct?
That was talking about us having a common understanding of nations, but what a common understanding is if I tell you don't do that, we have a common understanding of what I want you to do.
Sure, but that evidence specifically talked about crafting international treaties, so in order for that to happen, that would mean that all those states would actually have to agree with the U.S. definition of cyber warfare, correct?
Okay, first off,
Sorry, it's a yes or no question, I have a couple seconds.
okay, to the judge's mind if I finish and answer the question. Basically what our policy does is it provides a framework to move ahead and form those international treaties, because we need definitions right now.
Okay.
I'm going to be addressing the case that the affirmative team presented. And we'll be looking specifically at a couple of issues. First, we're going to look at topicality. Do they fit under the topic that they're supposed to fit under? And then we're going to be looking at what's happening in the current system. And last, we'll look at a couple points of how they can't fix the problems that they've discussed. So first, let's start by talking about the topic. Now, under this year's resolution, the affirmative team has to significantly reform U.S. policy towards Russia. In their case, they define towards as with regard to, for, or about. Now, the interpretation of this is that this policy has to be towards Russia. It has to be with regard to Russia. But the point is, it has to be with regard to Russia only. The affirmative team can't run a policy that is with regard to the entire world and then say, oh, Russia's included in that, and that's basically what they're doing. When we're talking about some sort of domestic cybersecurity policy, that is going to apply to any cyber attack coming from any country. So this does not fit under the resolution and the resolutional interpretation, even under their definition of towards, because it can't be towards Russia and the rest of the world. So the violation is that there are other threats. And I'm going to read a couple pieces of evidence talking about how the United States faces cyber threats from countries besides Russia. Lieutenant Commander Matthew Sklarov wrote in fall of 2009 that in June 2007, Chinese hackers disabled 1,500 Pentagon computers, including those of the Secretary of Defense. Here we see a huge cyber attack coming from the nation of China. The United States faces cyber threats from the nation of China. This policy isn't just towards Russia, it's towards China as well. Now this also relates to the doctrine, the cyber doctrine that they said Russia has, and they said Russia is the only country that has a doctrine that says they want to use cyber capabilities offensively. Actually, that's not the case. According to The Economist in July 2010, Iran claims to have the world's second largest cyber army. Russia, Israel, and North Korea boast efforts of their own. So contrary to what the affirmative team said in their first justification, it's not just Russia that has these weapons and that is willing to use them offensively. We see that Iran is claiming a large cyber army. Israel and North Korea, they all have cyber forces. So this goes down again to that violation. The affirmative team is not topical. This is a policy towards all of the world, and it includes Russia. They can't do that. The impact of this is that the affirmative team is not under the resolution. If they're not adhering to the resolution, then their case is not legitimate. It can't be voted for, and the ballot has to go negative. Now let's get down to what's happening in the current system, and we're going to be talking about the affirmative team's case specifically and the evidence that they presented. So they talked about the status quo, and they said that the U.S. has a cyber command force, but we lack a clear definition of what cyber war actually is. And we would agree cyber command is in place. But let's take a close look at that evidence that talks about lacking a clear definition. It doesn't just say we haven't implemented a definition, it says we don't know what cyber war is. This is very key. And here's the direct quote from the evidence. It says that we're thinking a lot about it, but not very clearly. We don't really understand what cyber war is. This is a retired Air Force general, former CIA director, and he's saying we don't know what cyber war is. What's the impact of this? This goes down to our solvency point, and that is going to be that there's no advocacy for the affirmative team's definitions. They got up here and all of a sudden in their mandates they said we're going to adopt the East-West Institute's definition of cyber warfare. Where is the advocacy for this? Where is the proof that this is the right definition of cyber warfare? As we can see, according to their own evidence, even the U.S. military and Cyber Command doesn't understand what cyber warfare is, doesn't know how we should define it. If they don't know how we should define it, how does the East-West Institute know? How does the affirmative team know? We have to see advocacy for this, and because we haven't seen advocacy, there's no reason to go for their definition. A lot of their evidence talked about how we need a definition and we need something that's clear. But one thing that we'd like to point out is if you have the wrong definition, that's going to be just as detrimental as no definition at all. Now let's look at some other pieces of evidence talking about how there are many different definitions for cyber warfare. Just to give you a taste of the idea that just because the affirmative team saying the East-West Institute says that this is the definition, there are other definitions. For instance, the FBI defines cyber terrorism as the premeditated, politically motivated attack against information, computer systems, computer programs, and data, which result in violence against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents. We can also see in the book Cyber War by Richard Clarke, a former national security and counterterrorism advisor in 2010. When the term cyber war is used in this book, it refers to actions by a nation state to penetrate another nation's computers or networks for the purposes of causing damage or disruption. So we can see that these are all experts, and they're giving different definitions of cyber warfare. The impact of this is, again, how do we know that the affirmative team's definition of cyber warfare is the right one? Until we get the right definition in place, the problems are not going to be solved. Now let's talk about the United States action, and they said that if we don't have a definition, the U.S. will not be able to act. Let's look at what the U.S. Cyber Command said June 1st of this year, talking about actions that we can take right now, even without a clear definition of cyber warfare, if we were to be attacked. This was from the Agence France-Presse, and they said, quote, the Pentagon said Tuesday that it would consider all options if the United States were hit by a cyber attack, as it develops the first military guidelines for the age of internet warfare. Now this is key. The affirmative team talked about how we need to develop guidelines and a structure for this warfare. That's what the U.S. Cyber Command is doing. We are developing those guidelines. And this again goes to that solvency point. Why does the affirmative team get to come up here and say that their ideas are better than U.S. Cyber Command and the U.S. military? The U.S. military is working towards having this definition. The difference between their definition and the affirmative team's one is that they're going to consider it, and when they put that definition in place, you can be sure it will be the right one, as opposed to the affirmative team just picking a random definition. We haven't seen advocacy for this. Let's go on and read a little bit more in this piece of evidence, and this says that the Pentagon spokesman Colonel Dave Lapham said Tuesday the White House policy did not rule out a military response to a cyber attack. We can see again that a Pentagon official is basically saying just because we don't have a cyber definition in place, that doesn't mean that we can't respond to cyber attacks. When we are attacked in cyberspace, we are able to respond with or without a definition. The impact is, if we can respond either way, let's not pass the affirmative team's plan. Let's wait for the right definition and implement it then, because our security is not in jeopardy in the current system. Now I'd like to look at a couple last points about their case. Going on to justification 2, they talked about how a common understanding brings security. And they said that definitions of cyber war and related terms are critical because they will drive how the laws of war and international treaties will prescribe the scope and use of cyber capabilities. This is also key. This talks about international treaties. If the U.S. is picking an arbitrary definition for cyber warfare that other countries don't agree with, how is this going to affect those international treaties? We can't have a common understanding if the United States picks a definition that other nations don't agree with. So for all these reasons, because the affirmative team's case is not merely towards Russia and is untopical, because we don't need their plan, and because the current system is better, I'd urge you to consider keeping the status quo. Thank you.
Alright, the judges are okay, that's fine. Alright, good morning. Well, I just have a couple of questions for you. First off, starting off under topicality, basically your argument here is that even under context, it doesn't fit, correct?
Correct.
Alright, now you did not challenge our definition of towards, correct?
No, I did not.
Okay. Now secondly, you brought up examples of where China has attacked the Pentagon. Now, did it specifically say attack in that piece of evidence?
It said disabled.
It said disabled. Okay, so that very well could have been espionage that they were trying to get out of the Pentagon.
I'm actually not sure, but the
Okay,
second
so that
piece-
was not an example of them attacking the United States.
I'm not sure. It doesn't rule out that it was an attack.
But it doesn't say it was.
The point is there are cyber threats from other countries.
Okay, but that does not say it was an attack, yes or no?
It doesn't say the word attack, no.
Okay, thank you. Moving down to your point about how Iran is also a threat. Now, that evidence said that Iran claims it has the second largest in the world, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, now why should we believe Iran?
You're saying that Russia's the only country that has a military doctrine. This says Iran says they have a cyber army. You're saying Russia's
Right,
the only
but
one
were there
that
any
has-
studies done on that cyber army? Do we know the capabilities of it? Do we know that they're actually a threat?
We're not sure the capabilities of it
Okay.
in this piece of evidence.
Okay, so the only source we have on that is Iran.
For this piece of evidence,
Okay,
yes.
thank you. Moving down to your solvency point, basically talking about how we have no advocacy for these definitions. Now, first off, did you show that any of our definitions are inadequate specifically?
No, we just said there's no advocacy.
Okay, did you contest the advocacy of the 15 experts who put together the definitions and said the government should adopt these?
The point is the government is saying they don't know what cyber warfare is. They know that these definitions are out there, and yet they're saying they're not specific enough or they're not the right definitions.
Okay, but did you challenge those 15 experts who said these are the definitions you need?
We challenged them by saying that the U.S. government is still saying they're not adequate.
The U.S. government, did the U.S. government specifically say that this report is not adequate?
No, but the U.S. government is saying they're
Okay,
still
so basically right now they could be completely unaware of this report, so they're not passing it, but there's still advocacy for this report in those 15 experts who put it together, correct?
I'm sorry, are you saying there's advocacy for implementing the definition? That's not what we're arguing.
That's not what you're arguing, correct, but what I'm arguing is saying the 15, did you challenge the 15 experts who all put together these definitions and said these are the definitions you should adopt?
We didn't critique those experts.
Okay, did you provide any reverse advocates saying that these are not the correct definitions?
We actually brought up a lot of different definitions from national security experts.
Right,
that
but was
are
there anyone who
different.
specifically to our report said these aren't the correct definitions?
Nobody said the East-West Institute definitions are
Okay,
terrible.
thank you. Moving down to your inheritance point, basically talking about already developing guidelines. Now, this evidence said we will do anything and all, correct?
I'm not really sure I understand the question.
Okay, could you please reread that evidence?
Sure. That was the piece about
That was the piece about
the Pentagon
yes.
currently? Okay. It would consider all options of the U.S.
all
Army.
options. Now, that's a pretty vague guideline, wouldn't you agree?
No, I wouldn't say so because
Okay,
it says
so you
they'll
can do
consider-
anything and that's a guideline?
No, what you're saying is we can't take any action without a cyber definition. And the U.S. government is saying we can take action, and later on it said we will
All right,
even
can I get
consider
that piece of
military.
evidence, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, what I want to be doing is looking over the negative team's argumentation. I want to be first looking at their problems with topicality, basically addressing each one of their points, and moving on to inherency and their issues with their justifications. So starting right out with topicality, let's take a look at their topicality arguments. Now, they had three key topicality arguments. The first one was basically this is a policy towards the whole world, and they went on to impact that in their two further arguments that China has attacked us and that Iran and North Korea currently pose a threat. I want to be looking at these, but I want to be starting at the bottom and working my way back up. We're going to start off looking at Iran and North Korea. Now, she brought up a piece of evidence from, I believe it was 2009 or 2010. Either way, I have a piece of evidence from 2011 here from James A. Lewis, who's the current director and senior fellow at the Center for Strategic International Studies. He said in 2011 that confrontational states such as North Korea and Iran do not yet have the capability to launch cyber attacks. And this is what my partner was really getting at in his cross-examination of the negative speaker. It's just because Iran says they have the capability to do something, a lot of it is bluff and bluster. We really don't know if they actually have the capability. What we see from this James A. Lewis, who's this director of Strategic Center for International Studies, he says neither North Korea nor Iran currently have the ability to actually attack us. And that is a more recent piece of evidence, so that's reason to prefer. Moving on, we're going to actually now look at China. China, the negative team has claimed China has attacked us in the past. I want to be looking at this a little bit more in depth. The piece of evidence was very vague. The reason? What was the cyber attack the piece of evidence was specifically talking about? What was their definition of cyber attack? We have no idea what they meant when they said they have launched a cyber attack against us. And this really underscores the whole purpose of the affirmative team's case. We really have no idea how to discuss cyber attacks or cyber war because right now there is no commonly accepted definition inside of the United States. So when we say, oh, they launched a cyber attack against us, what does that piece of evidence even mean? If we're having a hard time debating about it in a high school league, think about national governments trying to work with each other inside of this new international sphere. Think of how much of a problem they're going to have if no definitions are currently available to them to be instituted and none exists in the current governmental structure. But now I want to specifically look at this issue of China, and I have a couple of pieces of evidence about this. The first piece of evidence I want to read is a piece of evidence from Radio Free Europe, who reported in November of 2010 that China may lead the world in cyber espionage that raids Western intellectual property, but Russia leads the way in being willing to take hostile action. China leads the way in cyber espionage, and that's what people have meant in the past when they said, oh, China launched a cyber attack against us. What they really meant was cyber espionage. Now, cyber espionage is very different from a cyber attack. Why? Because cyber espionage is a form of spying. Now, historically, no nation has ever responded with a military confrontation when they found out another nation was spying upon them. So what we see is that espionage in the status quo, even in the physical realm, doesn't warrant an armed reprisal. What we do see is that an attack would necessitate an arms reprisal. And this is something that Russia has shown they're willing to do. They've shown us that they're willing to actually launch an attack and that they are the most aggressive state. My next piece of evidence on this China issue is a piece of evidence from Seymour H. Harsh, who wrote in the Annals of National Security in November of 2010 that Jonathan Polak, an expert on the Chinese military who teaches at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, said the fact is the Chinese are remarkably risk-averse. Basically, the Chinese don't want to attack us if they know there's going to be fear of reprisal. They don't want to attack us if there is some harm that could come to their nation. So you see that China really doesn't pose an issue right now, and neither do Iran or North Korea. But now I want to specifically look at their first topicality argument. I said I was going to work my way back up. That we're passing a policy basically toward the whole world. Now, if you look at our definition of towards, our definition of towards is with regard to, for, or about. What is the purpose of this policy? The purpose of this policy is for Russia. Why? Because we presented in multiple pieces of evidence, Russia right now does pose a threat. But as our justification 3 said, common understanding is also necessary. Now, you may be asking yourself why. Why do we need common understanding with Russia if they're just going to launch an attack upon us? Well, because attacks are only part of our international policy inside of the cyber realm. The other aspect of this is actually working with other nations and dialoguing with them about creating multilateral treaties. And this was something that the negative team also touched on. In a piece of evidence from the East-West Institute in January 2011, they said, quote, over the last 3 decades, strategic dialogue between Russia and the United States has been an essential part of the drive for a safer and a better world. The resulting series of significant nuclear arms agreements, most recently the New START Treaty, represent tangible evidence of progress for people everywhere. Cybersecurity is the new challenge for continued cooperation between Russia and the United States. So what we see is that when the United States has dialogued with Russia in the past, we've actually been able to bring about great benefits for the world. And what we see is that cybersecurity is that new nuclear challenge that must be addressed through multilateral dialogue. The issue is that unlike a nuclear arm, which we have a definition for and we know what it is, we don't have a definition for what a cyber attack actually is and what would constitute an assault in that area. And that's why a definition is so critical to be instituted so that we can work with Russia, so that we can dialogue with them and come up with multilateral approaches. So we've clearly seen this is a policy for Russia. Moving on to the negative speaker's inherency points, she had a couple of these. Now I want to start off right at the beginning and talking about the military. Basically, she had 2 points under the military. The first was that the military doesn't know how to define cyber war, and the second was that the military is already trying to work on this issue. Now, a piece of evidence that said the military is trying to work on this issue said Cyber Command would use all available elements to respond, basically. But what are those available elements, I would ask you? That piece of evidence is incredibly vague about telling us what the actual approach Cyber Command would take would be. We have no idea. The other issue is that Cyber Command right now is taking a failing approach. Cyber Command is actually just, what they're doing is adopting unilaterally armed conflict rules and legislation right into the cyber realm. And this is something that really can't happen. According to the Guardian newspaper, an article by John Reed, who's the current chairman for the Institute of Security and Resilience Studies at the University College of London, he said that the transnational cyber environment is largely impervious to inherited legal frameworks. For instance, it's a great leap to assume that a cyber attack would fit neatly within the UN Charter's definition of armed attack. So what we see is that unilaterally just adopting current physical definitions into the cyber realm is not possible. We need new cyber definitions. Moving on to her second issue under the military, what we see is that she has issues with the definition. Basically, she was talking about our second inherency point, that definitions are needed, and we don't have any right now, so we don't have any clarity. What this piece of evidence was specifically saying is that the government doesn't have any clear definitions right now. Not that they don't exist, but that the government doesn't have one. What we see is we actually need a definition inside of the government if we are to have any key responses here. Now basically she said, or the negative speaker said, why would the East-West Institute's definitions be superior? And I have a couple of reasons for this. My first is that they're multilateral. These definitions were created with input from both Russian and US officials. My second response is that they're all-encompassing. They don't just define cyber attack, but they also define different cyber elements so that we have a comprehensive taxonomy for addressing cyber warfare. And my third response is that 15 different officials with various backgrounds in security, military, and intelligence studies all worked on these definitions together. So we clearly see large consensus among officials when working on these issues. We clearly see superiority through these definitions to even like something like the FBI definition or Robert Clark's definition, which were just unilaterally adapted. The next thing we need to be moving on to is her last problem. This was under justification 4. Basically, she said we need efficient multilateral treaties to actually be able to do anything. Well, what I'd like to bring up here is that Creating definitions is the first step to creating multilateral treaties. As we talked about, definitions are needed for dialogue between Russia and the United States. But in a piece of evidence from PC World, we can also see an impact to this. PC World reported in June of 2011 that formalizing a policy stating what the U.S. will do if attacked in cyberspace may push international organizations to develop and accept international codes of behavior for cyber warfare. So the United States action is really the first step towards bringing about any benefit inside of the cyber realm. Definitions are necessary if we were to continue to maintain peace and security and actually be able to secure any international treaties for long-standing growth. Thank you, and I now send open for cross-examination.